Never Mind the Buzzwords is a community event from Jigsaw Better Business. Taking place bi-monthly, its aim is to build a community of businesses and professionals where you can learn, share and connect. It's about going beyond the jargon and coming away from each session with knowledge, tangible tools, tips, strategies, and hopefully an extended network. Each event is focused either on people or a process. In the process sessions, we talk about how we deliver value in our business. Topics here include lean tools and thinking, operational excellence, sustainability, and digital transformation. In the people sessions, we look beyond the process to the who, discussing topics like leadership, teams, culture, and professional development. Never Mind the Buzzwords isn't just an event that you attend, it's an event to participate in. So get involved in the conversation, put your camera on if you can, share your thoughts, ideas or questions in the chat, or feel free to unmute yourself. And don't forget to stay in touch. We have a LinkedIn group where we upload resources and recordings from this community. And if you follow Never Mind the Buzzwords on Eventbrite, you'll be notified whenever we post a new event. Okay, hello everyone. I hope you're all doing well. Can I just check, can everyone see my screen okay? I am just trying to, okay, perfect. So yeah, you're very welcome to our Never Mind the Buzzword session. We are joined today by Jennifer Dowling. I'm really looking forward to chatting with Jennifer. She's a chartered work and organisational psychologist, and she is the director of a company called Train Remote, who help companies to harness the potential of their remote work and provides engaging and inclusive training offerings to organizations. She also has 15 years of management and project management experience, and then that educational background and practical experience in the world of organizational psychology and talent development. So I'm really looking forward to speaking with Jen today about this topic of hybrid work. I think a lot of people have probably come across this term, but just so that we're all clear on it, it is basically a flexible work model that supports a blend of in-person or remote or on-the-go workers. And in an ideal world, it offers the autonomy to choose, where and how you do your work. Where do you feel most productive? The business representation group, IBEC, they did research back in 2021 and found that a majority of Irish companies were planning to do a hybrid model. I think a lot of companies are seeing the value of it, or their people are seeing the value of it. And in other research as well, I've seen over 80% of over 9,000 workers that were surveyed said that they would prefer a hybrid model, so that just that opportunity to work from home at least some of the time, just that little bit of flexibility. But then again, there are other people who are hoping for more face-to-face collaboration opportunities. Like I think I saw research that was about 3/4 of Gen Z work employees were saying that they would like more face-to-face collaboration opportunities. So I think there is that appetite for a bit of both. So that's kind of what we're talking about today. I actually also came across this research very recently. You can see there, it's from the 9th of March. By the way, we'll be sharing these slides with you in our resources folder that we usually share after each session. Andrea, you might actually just pop the link to that into the chat, just so that people can access this. This is where we'll be uploading the slides. So if you do want to have a look at that study, you can do so. But there was this one that in particular that found that a lot of hybrid workers are able to have a little bit more time to eat better. They have more time to kind of prepare food from scratch rather than getting something on the go. They can exercise more, they can get more sleep. And about a quarter of them have lost quite a significant amount of weight. You can see there nearly 10 kg or more. So again, a lot of people are kind of using hybrid to prioritize their health and well-being. But then on the other side, I've also seen things of people having trouble switching off from work if they're working from home, and they might be feeling lonely or isolated or feeling like they're kind of excluded from the decision making in their workplace. And that was a problem before COVID. People who were remote were often being overlooked for promotions because, when someone's sitting in front of you, you can see that there was a bit of a bias towards the people who are in an office. Or other people are finding it difficult to focus when they are at home. So, there is definitely quite a few challenges, quite a few benefits. And today we're really going to dive into that from a variety of ways, I suppose, or levels, individuals, teams, and organizations. So really looking forward to having a bit of a chat about this. Jen, do you want to maybe come in and just say maybe a little bit about kind of the work that you're doing at the moment? What's kind of, how are you covering hybrid working with your clients?
Yeah, thanks, Julie. And hi, lovely to be here. Nice to meet you all today. I suppose I've been looking at remote and flexible work. Pre-pandemic, we were looking at, what were the supports, what were the blockers to more flexibility and remote working in organizations. Like that, we were seeing kind of slow moves towards flexibility. I think the most recent data we had pre-pandemic kind of gave us about 31% of organizations were offering some form of flexible working. So you could work, a day, maybe or two a week from home, but a lot of that was informal flexibility, and a lot of that was kind of informal arrangements with managers and tended to be kind of more available to those more senior in organizations. And obviously then during the pandemic, a lot of us, and again, I suppose when we talk about hybrid and remote working, we're talking about a small amount of the population who can actually work that way, that their job allows them to work that way. But those who could worked, predominantly remotely. And like you said, that the data was really interesting around that. We saw a lot of people who, 50% of whom, if you look at the Irish data, had never worked remotely before. 90% of those were indicating that they'd like to continue having some form of flexibility going forward, some form of remote working. But equally, as you said, we were also seeing this trend. And if we look at large-scale studies done by Microsoft, for example, we saw this kind of real trend for people to want to have more face-to-face time, to be collaborating more. So this is where kind of hybrid has come, is trying to meet both of those, this kind of idea that people do want to work more remotely or have more flexibility, but also that they want to see each other a little bit as well. So I suppose what I have been working on during the last couple of years was really trying to support managers around how they can best support their teams in a more hybrid, remote or more flexible environment. And then also kind of working with individuals and how do we work best, or how do we support our own kind of thriving, and then kind of at an organizational level in terms of how do we transition more to more flexible ways of working that work for everybody.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, really interesting. That's brilliant. And just as you were speaking there, I just popped up a poll to see how people are working at the moment. So you should all be able to see that in front of you. You can see a good few people have voted already. I'm just asking, how do you currently work? Is it fully in person, fully remote, or hybrid? What's your preferred way? Is it fully in person, fully remote, or hybrid? And then how important is flexibility to you? So I'm just giving it another minute for the last couple of people to vote if they would like to. It's an anonymous poll. So if I just pop up the results, we can kind of see who's in the room with us. A majority there, 63%, say they are working hybrid, and the remaining 37% are working fully remote. So we actually don't have anyone on the call fully in person, which I think is really interesting that, like you said, half people had never done it before COVID. So obviously we can see how much that's accelerated. On the second question of what's your preferred way of working, again, a majority, 68% there say hybrid is their preferred. So probably makes sense why you're on the call today. 26% said they actually prefer fully remote, and then just 5% say they prefer to actually be fully in person. And then on that question of how important is flexibility at work to you, 100% of people said very important, as opposed to not very or somewhat important. So a lot of people wanting that flexibility that we just talked about there.
And I think this is really interesting, Julie, as well, because we're asking the question a lot now of which is better, the office or home, and ultimately, and you kind of said this in your intro as well, like the question is not, is it better in the office, is it better at home? It's where is your work done best? How can location be a tool that serves your work? Ultimately, the question isn't about office or home, it's about what environment is going to support an individual to do their best work, and like bearing in mind that your best work is done when your well-being is taken care of, your individual needs are taken care of, your flexibility is being kind of respected. So I think that's an important point.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's a really important point as well, because I think very often what gets focused on is, what are you getting done? What is kind of being ticked off your list? And I think there is a little bit of a kind of paranoia around productivity. I think a lot of managers are afraid that people aren't as productive, or how do I know if they're being productive if I can't see them? So could we talk a little bit about that kind of maybe worry around productivity, and what is the research telling us?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is a really interesting area right now, and ultimately it's so important, right? And whether hybrid or increased flexibility is going to work or not is, can we be productive in these changes in working practices? And I suppose we're still in really early stages, like from a data perspective, of being able to say conclusively whether productivity is impacted or not. If we look at kind of pre-pandemic, there was a couple of, maybe two that I can think of, large-scale studies that showed increases in productivity, with increases in flexibility. During the pandemic, I know Microsoft did a big piece of research, and what they found was that productivity remained the same or higher. But kind of post-pandemic, we're still in really early stages of being able to see good research around this. I know Nicholas Bloom from Stanford has done a piece of research in China specifically around hybrid, and early stage, what he's found is no impact on performance. But he has found, so not negative, but sustained performance. But he has found reduced attrition and reduced sick leave. So again, it's coming to your point around the other factors that it's impacting, not just productivity. And something that we're seeing that I think is really interesting to explore, and it'd be interesting to see what people who are on the call think about this. But there was some really interesting research that came out recently, where 87% of employees are saying that they are more productive in this environment. But only 12% of leaders are saying that they have full confidence that their teams are productive. So this gap between us feeling like we're very productive and people saying they're busier than ever, but managers and leaders saying, I don't know if my teams are productive or if they're actually, doing what they need to be doing. And I think that's a gap that's really important to look at, right?
Yeah.
And I suppose there's you probably have some thoughts on this, Julie, as well, but there is one piece of this puzzle that I think is interesting to look at. And it's, again, another piece of research that looked at how managers and individuals define productivity. And if you look at, so they looked at managers defining productivity as outcomes, and individuals tended to define productivity as output. If I feel like I'm doing a lot, I'm feeling very productive, but as a manager, are the outcomes that I expect from that individual being achieved? So I think there's sometimes a gap there.
Yeah, that's really interesting, actually, that outcomes versus outputs. And as Jen said there, pop any thoughts into the chat as we go along, or any questions. I can see Matthias pop something in there. He's saying, he thinks it's bizarre that people that do remote work can be overlooked for promotions. He's doing a digital nomad, and fantastic way to combine work and explore new cultures. And so as he's meeting other digital nomads or travelers on his journey, it's a unique way to learn more about approaches to work and career in different cultures. So again, you're kind of, that's another added benefit. You're sparking those ideas, how new knowledge can be no good for an employer when new ideas are needed is a mystery to me. Yeah. So I think that kind of captures what we were just saying there about the difference between how, say, managers perceive productivity or, someone doing their job well versus how a worker perceives it. So that's really interesting.
And there's all this untapped, exactly to Tobias's point, there's all kind of these untapped potentials of what ways of working now too. I work from a hub, and like the amount of cross, people meeting each other and sharing ideas or potentially working with each other or bringing new knowledge from the people they're meeting into their own organizations. So just like to Tobias's point, when you go to other cultures, you work with different organizations, there's huge learning in that too, I think.
Definitely. Yeah. And something else that you touched on there is when we were saying about where can you do your best work, and you mentioned that idea around your well-being as well. It's not purely just your output, like we say. So I don't know, would you have any thoughts there on that sort of, like I mentioned at the start, of some people are kind of prioritizing their well-being more. How is that again? What's coming through in the research there?
Yeah, and I suppose kind of reiterating the point that you made, it's kind of clearly coming out from the research that post-pandemic we're prioritizing our health and well-being in a different way than we were, pre-pandemic. I mean, that would even be interesting for people who are on the call to reflect on, is your well-being more of a priority now, maybe over the last couple of years or as a result of the last couple of years for you than previously. And one of the things that we're seeing as well is that people are really valuing that feeling of kind of being cared for by an employee, having their needs kind of met, but that kind of fair and equitable treatment as well. So that aspect of well-being being really important for people, and having really strong correlations with kind of happiness and well-being in the workplace post-pandemic.
Yeah, because I do think as well, our relationships form a big part of our well-being and our resilience as well. And just anecdotally, I think a lot of people are finding it can be easier to build good quality relationships with people in person. But again, I suppose it probably just depends on the person or on the relationship and on the way that you use technology to communicate, I suppose.
Absolutely. And in lots of ways, we've been kind of thrust into this, some of us have been working remotely for a long time, but for others, this is a whole new way of trying to communicate and collaborate with people. But I think that point you make about individual differences is really important. Like if I think about my own story, I started working remotely about 8 years ago now. And I had a great team, great flexibility, really interesting role. But I was a couple of kind of months into it and I was like, I didn't like it. I had really low motivation towards the job, really low energy. I kind of thought I'm going to have to back this in. And I remember meeting with a colleague of mine and saying it to her, and she said to me, do you think maybe it's the drop off in interaction with other people? And, I'm very much on the extroverted side of the scale. I really need that social connection. And it didn't mean that I couldn't continue remote working. It didn't mean that I'm fast forward now and I'm an advocate for remote working, but I had to know that about myself. So I had to learn that about myself and be able to manage that for myself. And ultimately, I ended up opening a co-working space and working from here, rather extreme measure. But equally, it's meeting people for coffee or going for a run after work, or finding a way to get that connection and social connectedness into our work days as well, I think is really important.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Just that, like you say, it's just that awareness of this is how I get my energy, or so if I'm not getting it from the day to day, then how can I get it outside of it? Or like you say, I think the co-working space can be a great solution, it sounds like. I'll just pop over to the chat for a second, and again, as Matthias is echoing kind of what you were saying about the co-working space. He did so last spring, combined working with home. So working at that co-working space, and again, getting those fresh perspectives, receiving feedback from co-workers, free coffee as well. So that's great. So brilliant. Yeah. So some people have positive experiences with those kind of hubs. I can see as well, Amanda popped into the chat about legal recruitment is where she works. And there's definitely a split of people who want to be in the office for productivity and those who want to be more remote. And the main concern is, for those who want to be in the office, is where the policy is very flexible, they end up in the office by themselves. So I think that's something. It's like we kind of need the flexibility of you can come in whenever you want, but then if you come in and you're there by yourself and you're on calls all day, it's like, why did I bother come in? Any thoughts on that side of things?
Yeah, I mean, I think it comes back to that point of shifting our kind of mindset around place. Like work is a place that we can go to if we want, if that place supports us working better, if working from home allows us to work better, then we do that. But it's about place as a resource, not as the place where, all meetings happen or everybody is in person. That we also have to, and I suppose the organizations that I see who are kind of managing the change to hybrid better now, and we're all experimenting with it, but they're also putting a lot of emphasis on how do we do informal connection when we're virtual as well. So we're not just banking on being in the office to connect with people, that we're actually thinking about how we do that, virtually. And when we are coming into the office, and a lot of these organizations, when they are intentionally bringing people in, they're doing it in a really intentional way. So we might let everybody work whatever way they like, but once a month, everybody's coming into the office and we're intentionally gathering when we're there. It's not just, see who's in the office and they might have a chat and they might connect and they might develop a relationship, but there's too much chance in that, so it's how do we intentionally do that, I think is important.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, definitely. So being intentional about it. I saw a comment as well that kind of starts maybe moving a little bit into more, we've been talking about how the individual works as a, in a hybrid world, and maybe moving into how a team, I think that kind of what we were just saying there, how a team might work in the hybrid world, and how managers manage in the hybrid world. One of the questions in the chat was, do you have any particular tools that organizations can use to move from that output focus to a more outcome focused approach? Any thoughts on that?
Yes, I think this is so important. I think what we can look at from that research around kind of the productivity paranoia thing is that clarity is key now. So people really need to have really good clarity on what work priorities are, and teams need to have really good priority on what the team priorities are. And they need to have shared spaces where they can have visibility on project development, or who's working on what and when they've moved it on to the next stage. So I think using tools to support that is really important. But I think managers now really need to look at how they manage performance and how they communicate expectations, in a really, really explicit and intentional way. And one of the things that, is coming out from the data, and definitely from organizations that I'm working with, is just, the increased importance of one-to-ones now, that the managers having those regular and consistent one-to-ones is really, really important in kind of setting out those expectations and in supporting people in kind of meeting those. Some of the best managers that I work with, they nearly have two one-to-ones. They have a one-to-one that is about work and a one-to-one that's just about connecting. So and really intentionally trying to do that on a really regular basis, I think is huge.
Yeah, brilliant. So it's being really intentional. It's not the performance review annually or biannually, it needs to be much more consistent. And something that we've done with teams before, in a kind of team workshop sort of creating like a team canvas, and it's something that we've touched on before in previous buzzword sessions. So the resource is somewhere there in the resources folder. I can kind of signpost it to people if they're interested, but just again, really intentionally creating who are we as a team, what do we stand for, what are our values, how do we like to communicate and make decisions, what are our strengths or weaknesses, things like that. So again, just you might have done it in the past, but it's just refreshing that and not leaving it as, oh yeah, we did that 5 years ago. It's like it needs to be continually kind of updated, I suppose.
I think that's such an important point, Julie, now as well, because we're kind of experimenting with all this, so like teams are maybe creating a communications agreement. So this is how we're going to communicate. This is when we're available. These are the different tools that we're using. But we need to revisit that, I would say every 3 to 6 months, what's working, what's not working, what tools are working for us, what aren't, do we need to change, or how often we're having, team huddles or whatever it might be. But we need to be iterating kind of all the time now. And I think that's a really important point.
Definitely, yeah.
One tool that I think works really well now as well is just kind of that user manual type tool. I don't know if people have come across that before, but, where each team member kind of reflects on, how they work best. best, or the times of day they work best, their preferences around communicating, their preferences around feedback, or instruction. Or so having that kind of internal reflection, but then creating a document or a PowerPoint that you can share that with your team. So you build up that resource where I know how best to work with Julie. Or also, if I come onto a team, I have access to everybody's user manual, so I can kind of, in terms of onboarding, which is sometimes a challenge, for a lot of organizations, you kind of have that insight from the beginning. So that can work really well, I think.
Brilliant. Yeah, no, I love that, them being called a user manual. I think I created one that was called like a ways of working, or sort of wow document. But yeah, I'm sure there's plenty of names for it. But yeah, I think really, again, just being a bit more explicit. And I think that kind of touches on like that importance of building relationships, because I think that sort of is a little bit at odds with the idea of productivity in a way. It's like there's this kind of, okay, we need to complete a task, so we can't spend time chatting and building relationships, but then you're missing out on the opportunity to kind of build a really productive team. I don't know, do you have any thoughts on that side of things?
Yeah, so I think this is really important as well, because when we're working kind of more remotely or more distributed, we really bank on people having, good relationships and good trust, that they share information with each other. So they feel like they can ask questions, so they feel like, they can flag problems before they become bigger problems. So actually that trust on teams is hugely important. And that people kind of form that trust when they have those informal conversations. When I learned that you have a dog too, or you like hiking, or whatever it is, all those things that like connect us as human beings. So I think that's the piece now that we if I was to kind of prioritize, or I say organizations need to prioritize, one thing is really that informal connection, giving people space to connect informally, and also making that space in a virtual way as well, so that we're not missing out on people who maybe aren't in office. But I think that's really, and I think, actually at the start of the pandemic, we were really good at that. There was a lot of, virtual coffees, team quizzes, doing fun things. And then that just kind of slid off, and we got too focused on kind of the formal. But you're right, we have to make space for that informal as well.
Yeah. And I suppose, there can obviously be challenges with building that kind of trust. But I suppose, like you say, it's making the time. Is there anything else other than making time for the kind of informal chats or communication? Any other ways of sort of building that trust in a team?
Yes, I mean, I think it's even not just at a team level, it's also at an organizational level, it's trying to get people to connect. And that's something we saw in the research as well, is that, people were communicating more with their teams during the pandemic, but less with the wider organizations. We became a little bit more siloed. And that's something we really have to watch as we go forward. So, I worked with an organization recently, and they have kind of chapters and guilds. So they have things that they have in common. So they bring people together who might be interested in tech, or in gaming, or in drawing, or in I had one group I worked with, and they were interested, they liked stitching. So they used to come together on Zoom, and they would have a glass of wine, and they'd stitch, or whatever it is, or another group who were into sketching, and they were an animation group, and they would kind of share sketches that they'd done. And so I think it's about allowing people to find commonalities across organizations and connect on those. I think that's really important as well. So there's really good examples of some companies who are doing that one.
Yeah, exactly. So it's kind of, there isn't obviously a one size fits all, but it's figuring out what works for our people and within our field or our industry. And you just mentioned there about kind of finding those commonalities. And it just sort of reminded me of, I guess, when it comes to really high performing teams, there is that sense of inclusion and a kind of welcoming of differences. Has hybrid working, has it had any impact on sort of diversity and inclusion?
Yes, I mean, I think we that's probably one of the biggest concerns, I think, that organizations and managers have going forward, is really, the potential negative impacts that we could have. But also there is significant potential opportunities too, I think. So we have the proximity bias, which I think we're talking about a little bit more now, and managers are getting more cognizant around kind of being more remote first or distributed first, so kind of trying to take that method into kind of how we're working, but also I think, you know, in terms of these kind of biases, I think the whole piece around how we manage performance is really important, right? So coming back to the productivity piece again, often before, you know, people who were maybe, you know, the most vocal or the most kind of outspoken, you know, maybe got opportunity where it wasn't always warranted, you know, and sometimes we assume people were working because they were, again, the most vocal or our peers to be working, but not necessarily always based off the actual, you know, achievement of outcomes. So I think if we get better at, you know, communicating outcomes and measuring those outcomes well, then it'll be clear, you know, who does warrant, you know, promotion or opportunity, and maybe those who haven't. And the data is showing us that, you know, that we're more likely to in a more virtual environment to put more weight on people's achievements than on their personality or on their so that's an interesting kind of potential impact on the whole area of diversity and inclusion, I think.
Yeah, really, really interesting. I'll just come back to the chat for a second. Eamon shared that in the early days of the pandemic, when everyone was in lockdown, you know, they had their online team meetings, the weekly or bi-weekly one-to-one. But the best move that the team made was that once per week, we had an hour-long coffee break where work chat was completely banned. It ensured that the team remained connected outside of the work environment. It's something that we naturally do face. It's something that we naturally do face to face, but it takes a bit of work to keep those connections up in the remote world. So yeah, I really like that example, the, you know, not allowed chat about work in this coffee break. So that's great.
I think that's great, Eamon, because I think, you know, if we just start kind of falling back on that'll happen when people are in office, then we're losing something, you know. So I think we still need to keep that space virtually as well. So.
Yeah, exactly. Anik has a question about any data to contemplate the value of self-care. I would like to see what exactly does it mean for people now. I wonder, because what we'll probably do is share the Microsoft research that you mentioned. Does that kind of tap into sort of self-care and well-being?
It does. It talks a little bit about well-being. I suppose I think what's really important when we talk about well-being, and Julie, I'm sure you kind of agree, is, you know, this as well, that the work practices that are impacting well-being, you know, not just the you know, because I think oftentimes there was the tendency to kind of say, okay, we'll give people gym membership or we'll put healthy food in the canteen, but really it's the work practices. It's, you know, ensuring that we are giving people the space to have boundaries, and that we're, you know, we're communicating, you know, expectations from all those kind of things. Those work practices and respecting people's boundaries and things like that are the things that impact our well-being as well. One of the other things that I think is interesting when you look at the research is that, you know, generally we associate autonomy and people having more flexibility and autonomy as naturally, you know, impacting our well-being, so that, you know, we'll have higher well-being or job satisfaction if we have more autonomy and flexibility. But actually there's also research that tells us that, you know, having more control is dependent on our ability to manage that control. So for some people we got loads of autonomy, but actually we didn't have and myself included, the self-management muscle developed enough maybe to manage our time, to manage our energy, to manage our focus. And so actually it can have, you know, negative impacts on our well-being as well. So I think we're all kind of trying to manage that as well. And I think for organizations, it's supporting people in developing that too is important.
Yeah, exactly. I really like that kind of highlight, because I think often people just say, oh, people need autonomy, they need more and more autonomy, but kind of like you mentioned there, it's not on its own, I suppose. And just another question that went into the chat there, do you have any recommendations, Jennifer, as initiatives for employee engagement and workplace wellness that work mostly remote? How would you encourage companies to adopt this new normal?
Yeah, and like I think, as you said, Julie, there is no one size fits all. Like, I think we kind of have to do two things now. I think we have to internally try things out. So like pilot things, pilot things like different tools that we might use, or bring people together once a month or once a quarter, or, whatever it might be, but, pilot things and get feedback on how they're working, or collect data on how they're working. So internally, that's what I think a lot of organizations are doing now. I haven't met the organization yet who has fully cracked hybrid working. I think we're all learning. But then I think also we need to be kind of looking externally. So like looking at some of the data and research that we're talking about, but also look at like some of the best practice from some organizations. So what's working, and speaking to other organizations. That's what's great about people sharing what they're doing, because I think it allows other people to see, oh, maybe I could be doing that, or I should be doing that too. And I think they're the two things we need to kind of actively doing now in organizations.
Definitely. Yeah, I think that's a great idea in terms of like experimenting and piloting and saying, okay, let's try this out. So if anyone has any things that, they've been doing in their workplace, do pop it into the chat. I think this is a good space to share all these different ideas of maybe something you tried and it didn't work, or something you're trying and it is working. So do keep those coming into the chat. So I suppose moving then a little bit more into the broader, organization wide, we've talked a little bit about that. In those kind of companies that are doing a hybrid, what kinds of sort of challenges are they facing, or what are they doing well?
Yeah, so I suppose, again, different organizations, different challenges, but some of the things that I'm hearing a lot now, and maybe it'd be interesting to have people share what kind of challenges they're experiencing as well in the chat. But, I hear a lot of people struggling with onboarding a little bit. I hear a lot of people kind of struggling with that cross-organization collaboration, so they're getting better at working at their teams, but actually across the organization, that's hard. I think, the whole piece around culture, I think, has made organizations kind of have to get a little bit more intentional about how they look at their culture. So understanding their culture a little bit better, and understanding their values, and how do we communicate that kind of maybe more intentionally in a kind of remote or hybrid environment. So I think those are some of the things that organizations are kind of grappling with now a little bit.
Yeah. And any sort of suggestions or learnings from, again, obviously it's very unique to each company, but I suppose, are there any examples of things that you're seeing some of your clients or some of the companies in research doing well to kind of handle those things?
Yeah, I suppose I think leadership are kind of playing a really big role now in kind of looking at themselves and how they work, and kind of looking at the culture and the values and how they communicate those throughout the organization. I think that the prioritizing connection piece is some organizations are doing that really well, and I think that's paying off too. I think piece around feedback is hugely important now, so opening up the channels of looking for feedback. I think I work with one organization recently, and they have put it on their agenda for their one-to-ones. How is hybrid working for you? So they're getting that active feedback, and then they're bringing that up to management level, and they're having the discussion on what's coming through, and that's feeding up. So it's how are we creating those channels? We're finding out what's working and what's not for people, what's supporting and what's blocking people working best. So they're the kind of things I think that organizations who are doing this, they're piloting and experimenting, they're taking feedback actively, they're looking at kind of their values and their culture, and how do we kind of communicate those, and they're really looking at connection as well.
Okay, brilliant. Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And I think what you're saying there about continually getting feedback, it's like, I think sometimes you hear companies talking about it as if there is a solution and they just need to find that and then do it and stick with it. And no, it's what's working now might not work in 2 months' time. Even like it can change so quickly. Like, even if a couple of months ago people might have gone, oh, I can't wait to get back into the office, I'm sick of COVID, I'm sick of being alone. And then now, they're kind of more conscious of, oh, there's actually, the cost of living is increasing, or, energy costs are increasing, and, considering all of those things. So it's like, it's just changing so quickly that if you're not continually experimenting and continually getting feedback, I think, it makes sense that you would fall behind.
And I know that also sounds exhausting for organizations and managers and leaders. But
Yeah.
I do think, like, particularly with just the amount of change we've had of late, it's just still so new. It's still so fresh, and there's no solution yet. It will become clearer. People will find more, suitable ways of working for their organization. But it is just to give it that little bit of time for, for people to settle, for practices and ways of working to settle. I think that's really important.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think, yeah, like obviously we've seen so much change in even the job market and people choosing to change jobs. So I think even if you are continually talking to people, having those one-to-ones, getting the feedback, then you're getting to talk to someone before they start going, God, I hate it here, I'm going to look for a new job. You've kind of caught them before that, which is so important. There's just another comment there about leadership. I think it's an important aspect to consider with remote/hybrid work is how you follow up employees and focus on the human aspects also outside of work. When I was in Split last year, I had a nice conversation with a fellow digital nomad from Sweden. She worked remote full time, and so did all her colleagues. Showed me that a couple of months earlier, one of her colleagues lost his brother. When the company's CEO heard about it, he flew to attend the funeral, met the employee and his family. So yeah, I think just really sharing that experience, or that story of a leader who clearly really cares, providing that support, caring about people both in work and outside of work. So yeah, that's a really nice story to share.
And it's that piece, even, I gave the example of kind of the one-to-ones, or having that formal one-to-one, but we're also having that social one-to-one. And we're being really intentional, at a peer level, but particularly at a manager level. Like, I often think managers are kind of the tethers often now for individuals to organizations. So like being really intentional about staying connected to what's going on with people, so that we notice changes, that we can, support their own kind of, their well-being and their kind of thriving as well.
Yeah. And we were talking there about all the change and the constantly having to kind of adapt to it. And I suppose companies now, they really need to be quite creative and innovative. I suppose that I find it can sometimes be challenging in a hybrid world to try and, like that collaborating in a creative way. Is there any sort of research or thoughts that you have in relation to how to be effective and creative in a hybrid world?
Yeah, I think this is really interesting, because this is often the argument that gets thrown against, hybrid and remote first working, is that we can't be creative and innovative unless we're all in the same room together. And like that's, I think the research isn't showing that. If you look at the research we're going to share after the session, but also even in practice, I mean, I think oftentimes when we get into creative spaces, it can sometimes be the most loudest voice that gets heard, right? And we can tend to go in certain directions that aren't always actually inclusive or diverse. And sometimes I think we can actually get far better outputs from doing work in advance of having those sessions. So it's about how do we brainstorm before we come into a session. So I work with a senior management team, and a couple of weeks ago we were doing our strategic priorities for the year ahead, and so we had a whiteboard. Everyone had access to it in advance of the session, and everybody shared their what they thought what was important, and did their thinking around that before we actually came in. And actually we ended up having was a much more kind of broad conversation than we would have had if we just come into the room and maybe the loudest voices would have got heard. So I think the same applies to that whole creativity and innovation. It's the pregame. And actually I think about this more and more in terms of working remotely and working well in a hybrid world. It's often about the work we do in advance of maybe coming together, or in advance of our one-to-ones, or in advance of our meeting in person, or it's the intentional piece we do in advance that's really important.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think it really kind of ties in with just creating that team environment where, like you say, it's not just the loudest person or the leader. It's not just their agenda that everyone is following, but actually, yeah, a much more inclusive team environment. There's another question in into the chat from your experience. What promising aspect around hybrid work would you encourage a PhD researcher to investigate? Any thoughts on that?
I suppose I think there's lots of promising aspects around hybrid work. I think if we're going to do it well, it'll involve us kind of leveling up a lot of things, leveling up how we manage, leveling up how we communicate, how we connect, how we manage performance, and all those things I think are really interesting. I think management level behaviors, what managers who are managing effective teams, our effective hybrid teams are doing now is a really interesting area to look at. Also, how hybrid teams are connecting, particularly connecting in a virtual space, I think is really interesting as well. How we're building trust in a hybrid environment. What are the factors that are impacting trust in a hybrid environment? Even going on to the use of kind of hubs and things like that as well, I think that's going to be another big area. And I see more and more teams and organizations now, giving people the option of being able to work from a hub as well. So having this kind of other space that we can potentially work from, what are the benefits of that too?
Yeah,
so it's really
brilliant.
interesting to look at, I think.
Yeah, definitely. I'm really glad to see so many people, popping things into the chat. Like a lot of people have their questions, their comments, their stories. It does, of course, seem to be a topic that, a lot of people are obviously interested in and are going through. And like we say, we're all just sort of figuring out a little bit as we go, continually getting more and more info. So if anyone else has any further kind of questions or comments, if anyone wants to unmute themselves, you are more than welcome to and join into the conversation. Or if you had any other kind of challenges you're experiencing or worries you have or benefits or positive experiences you have, keep those coming into the chat. So Jen, any other kind of things that you were taking as things you found most interesting from any, again, like we were talking a bit about Microsoft's research, but any even your own experiences or anything like that that's really jumping out at you that we haven't talked on just yet?
I suppose I think there's probably looking at the research overall and maybe looking at talking to different organizations and managers now, I think if I was to break it down and say to a company, what are the 3 things that I would really focus on now? Is looking at communication, looking at performance management, and looking at connection, and looking at them from the level of at a team level, what are we doing well? What could we be doing better? At an organization level, what are we doing well? What could we be doing better? And also, at an individual level, what am I doing well? What could I be doing better? So I think kind of those 3 areas are really important, and I think reflecting on what's working and are not within those 3 areas is really, really useful now.
Yeah, definitely. Those sound like really, really important areas to focus on. Just coming to the. Oh, sorry, Annie, did you want to? I just see you there. Yeah, how are you?
Yes, very good. I'm sorry I couldn't join earlier without the cam, but as soon as I arrive home, I turn it on.
No worries.
Thank you so much for doing this. I have a question in regards of the future of career, such as accounting and careers that rely more in technology. How are we preparing the human to confront with the reality of vanishing into, we don't know yet, but that career is going to turn into something else? How is the stress coping mechanism in the inside of, in the meantime, I need to keep performing, keep paying my bills, and yet I know that my career is going to disappear sooner than not.
Yeah, really interesting.
So the question, if I have it right, is just how careers are changing and the potential for people's careers maybe not to be existing in a couple of years' time, and how do we prepare ourselves for that?
In your experience, how the person, more than how we prepare, is, in your experience, what is the worry? Because your career is part of you. So seeing and contemplating that idea is practically as part of you is disappearing, right? It's a role in you in society. It's a role that's part of who you are. So what you have experienced when you talk to people in performance and in companies, and what do they say?
I think it's a really interesting question. And I think that the point that you kind of made there, that our career is part of you, like our identity is part of our career, but also our career is more than just a title. You know, there's a skill set or a set of skills that make up that career. And I think now what's interesting and exciting is looking at what are those skill sets and what of them do I want to develop more, or could I develop more based on where things are going? You know, what are skills that maybe are not going to be as relevant to me? I think this whole area, and actually it's a really important point even in the hybrid work conversation, is, you know, how are we supporting people's learning and development when we're in a hybrid work environment? And organizations have a responsibility there as much as individuals do. And if we look at even ourselves, obviously, and the changes that are happening in careers, but also if we look at, you know, the generations that are coming up and the prioritization of learning and development for people, you know, organizations have to do this because the data is telling us people will leave if they don't feel like they're being developed. So I think for all of us now, it's looking at the skill sets we have and what areas we want to develop in, and ensuring that our organizations are supporting us to try and develop those areas going forward. So I think that there's personal responsibility, but I also think there's organizational responsibility. And smart organizations know that they're going to have to change too. So, you know, that works hand in hand.
So I love that answer. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense what you're saying. And in that regard, what tools are they using in the company? Are they using emotional intelligence tools? What is it there to bring that gap in those two situations where you're absolutely correct? It's part of me. I'm responsible to notice my skills, but also to be appreciated by the company and say, hey, let's put this to use in a different way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose like different organizations are using different tools. And again, I think we're coming back to kind of those really good, like one-to-ones, that really good conversation that we're having, or feedback that we're giving, you know, to managers around where I'd like to go, and managers listening and understanding the wider organizational direction and trying to tie those two together, you know, and giving opportunities. So I think that, I'm not sure if I'm answering your question there now. But
because
yeah.
I'm very global, I know, and it's very, that's why it's come back to you in your experience. I'm very interested to know in your experience. You cannot answer for the world, but in the work of line that you have, you can tell me, look, at the moment, what we are using is such a tool because that's what works at the moment. We don't know tomorrow. That's what I want to hear. What is working for you?
I mean, we do, some organizations are using tools like the EQI or different emotional intelligence tools to soft skill tool map, to map skills. I don't know, Julie, other than that, I mean, I don't know if I can think offhand of any particular tools that I'm seeing organizations use effectively to answer your question, Nick. Maybe, Julie, you have more.
Yeah, no, I think you did. I think it's the one-to-one, which is we come back again to be human and to listen to one another. And then to negotiate again, what can we do together? I think you answered beautifully. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And, you know, to reiterate that, it's the manager as a coach as well now, you know, that having those good, as you said, listening well, having those good kind of coaching conversations brings that out in people too.
Yeah, definitely. Just to come back to the chat, then there's another question that Steve has asked. How do you see governments supporting this new way of working and the initiatives for supporting remote workers, etc.?
I suppose I can speak from the hub perspective, maybe, in terms of government supports there have been huge in trying to kind of sustain and support hubs. They've built a connected hubs network, which allows people to book hubs across the country and have kind of a lot of access to different resources through that. So I think that's really positive. Definitely, yeah, I think there's really positive moves in government to try and support remote working as best as possible. There's still a lot of things that could be done, but that's always that's always the case.
Yeah, I know the connected hubs were doing for a while those vouchers. So again, just kind of making it more accessible to access those hubs, you know, kind of, okay, try it out for a day, see do you like it, kind of thing. So but yeah, so there does seem to be a few initiatives. Just to go back to creativity, Becky put in a really interesting comment saying critical to creativity is attention restoration theory, where getting your head away from the problem and taking some time in nature will help your mind wander into a more inspired or curious space. And this isn't always possible in the office, so it can be better to do working remotely. And then to take those creative ideas to a central space for brainstorming collectively, as you mentioned, can be really beneficial to the full creative process. I think we sometimes forget this part. So yeah, I think that's a really important part and really good insight there, isn't it?
It's such a great point, and it's another one of the opportunities that we have is to understand our focus a little bit better. What allows us to focus or to be creative. And getting ourselves in. It's again a bit like the pre-game. How do we get ourselves into that space where we can be creative, we can focus. Yesterday morning, I went for a run in the morning. I had a really important piece of work I needed to do for 2 or 3 hours. I was able to go for a run. Have it in my head, come back, and then put myself into that space and cut off my distractions and be able to work like that. And that's a great opportunity, I think, for people to be more productive and more creative.
Absolutely. Yeah, definitely. And I can see as well another comment about, one of the challenges about remote and hybrid work is the kind of blurred lines between work and your spare time. Because work is so available, it's not like, oh, I have to go into the office, you can just open the laptop. So it's just about having maybe those clear work/life kind of boundaries or schedules. And the lecture that Matthias attended, they encouraged you to have a family/love life outside of work. According to the lecture, there should be 3 aspects of life to consider: that work, life, love, balance. So again, I suppose it's like you kind of mentioned about employees taking that responsibility to set those boundaries, and then kind of management and an organization creating systems that also respect those boundaries as well.
Completely. And that's the experimentation piece. It's happening at organization level, but it's also happening at individual level, because we have this increased autonomy now to think about how do we manage our energy, how do we manage our focus, how do we manage our time.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So this has been really, really interesting. I'd actually feel like I could just keep chatting away forever, but I'm conscious we're kind of coming towards 12 o'clock. So I just even wanted to ask, if people would like to share in the chat, like what's one idea or one thing that you are taking from today? Anything that maybe you would like to do yourself, or that you want to maybe introduce in your organization, anything you're taking from today. I think there's been a lot of interaction on the chat, so that's been really, really great to see. I think a lot of people are thinking about this concept, so it'll be great to hear what's one thing you're taking from today. And then just to give you a heads up for next month, or not even next month, in a couple of weeks' time, on the 29th of March, it will be our next Never Mind the Buzzwords session. So I'll be chatting with Stephen Short. He grew up in 2 family businesses and ended up buying both of them. And he helps people to do succession planning more effectively. So we'll be talking a bit about that, whether that's you're in a family business or you're in an organization and you want to kind of ensure the continued success of the organization. So Andrea will pop the link to that into the chat, or you can scan this QR code which is on the screen as well. Do absolutely keep in touch, because there'll be lots of future events. There'll be lots of kind of resources that we'll be sharing, and we'd love to keep in touch with you. So we will be sending out resources on the mailing list, and we'll be on LinkedIn as well. So that is pretty much all from me. I can see a few comments into the chat, and I suppose we can maybe hang on for another couple of minutes if anyone wants to ask any further questions. But for anyone who has to drop off for 12 o'clock, just want to say thank you so much for joining us, and really looking forward to hopefully seeing you all at the next one. And thank you so much again, Jennifer. That was a really, really interesting conversation. I think a lot of people took a lot from it.